Hello and welcome to Books and Buns, WORLDwrite's show that discusses brand new books with the author over tea and, you guessed it, buns. We are delighted to have with us James Heartfield. James Heartfield is the author of this amazing book, The Equal Opportunities Revolution, which is available to buy on Amazon. I'm Marisa Pereira, and to discuss the book with us today, we have Eleanor Smith-Han, Fraser Myers, and Isabella Drobeck. While I pour you some tea, James, would you like to kick us off and explain why you decided to write this book?
It's really kind of the book of my life in a way, because since I went to college, since I was at school really, the thing I remember over and over again is that Britain at various times has been racked by big arguments about women, their rights and their representation in the workforce, and also about people of colour. Growing up in the 1970s, everybody could see that inequalities were huge. People had different feelings about that. You know, some were defensive and didn't like to talk about it and maybe would hope that it would go away as a question. But I think over time, most people have come to the view that equality of opportunity is a great thing. And I'm really talking about how that change took place. And also I wanted to give a sense that even though I think there have been some great changes, some really important changes in the way that employers have changed the workforce and the way that they've recruited more women into work, the way they've recruited more of the black and migrant communities into work, that even as that's happened, it's not really quite been the utopia that people have hoped for. I suppose the thing that really caught me first was how strange it was that the most change happened at what seemed like the very worst time. Let me explain. Margaret Thatcher had just been elected, and all of us, radicals on the left, were convinced, and I think we were right, that this was really bad. That she was a retrograde prime minister, that her government was committed to driving women back into the home, that they were racists and they were brutal, and the police chiefs that they set upon migrant communities were horrible. And yet, that is exactly the time when the big changes, the big reforms in work took place. The big influx of women into the workforce comes at just that point. And same also, though it's been a much bumpier ride, I think if you look at the situation of the black community in Britain, there has been a steady advance, and in particular that employers now, whereas they used to routinely and openly discriminate, in some ways push the anti-discrimination position even more forcefully sometimes than their employees.
So you talk about the fact that the Conservative government that was known for being hostile to immigrants and actually had quite a conservative view of the place of the woman, in the family and so on. So why do you think she adopted those policies?
I don't think it was her. I don't think her frame of mind changed that much, and many of the people in her administration, like Norman Tebbit, were pretty old school golf club racists, and their views privately, which we come to find out later on, were often horrible, but in a way that didn't matter, because it was the world of work that really changed. The one victory that they really had under their belt was organised labour, which they ripped to shreds. There was a kind of a deal, the post-war social democratic deal with Labour was very much a deal with a core working class, with mostly male, almost exclusively white workers, skilled workers, and their representatives who, having fought for their position, had really consolidated the rights of one section of society and were less interested in the others. And when they ripped up that deal and they liberalised the labour markets and increased employment, that's one of the big changes, is that we had about 21 million in the workforce in 1980, and it rose to 29 million. And where were those people coming from? Britain was recruiting scores, thousands, millions of women into the workforce, and it was also migrant workers coming into the workforce, and that was good for employers. Employers individually, in their own prejudices, might be hostile to this, but employers as a whole understood that actually these changes seemed to work for them, and they were quite keen on equal opportunities policies. They found over time that it enhanced their authority over the workforce. First off, it made them feel better about themselves. That's important because they're human. So it was good to be an equal opportunities employer, but it was a nice badge to have on the front of the office rather than a mean-spirited sacking employer. Also, they discovered that by liberalising the labour market, by drawing on more people, they could really undermine the collective power of those people who were challenging them.
And what was the effect of that for the workers in the long term?
You know, this is a complicated thing because nobody would want to go back. You know, there's no sense in which you would think it was a great idea to have a workforce which was based on discrimination. But at the same time, the inequalities on the questions of race, the inequalities of men and women, though they've been moderated, the inequality that never goes away and in fact seems to get much worse is the inequality between those who employ and those who are employed. Working people, their incomes have really been held down to an amazing degree, even as the economy has grown.
One thing I find really fascinating is that in a lot of the contemporary discussion about equal opportunities and pay differentials, particularly between men and women, the focus really is on usually wealthy women. So, for instance, the BBC pay scandal had people squabbling over whether they should earn £400,000 instead of £300,000. And these extremely wealthy women were able to sort of pose as champions of equal opportunities when asking for their pay to be raised to put them in the 0.01% of earnings rather than just the 1%.
The whole BBC pay row and similar rows, especially like Wimbledon and top sports people, I think they do stand out because they are very exceptional. But they obviously speak to something because lots of people who aren't earning £120,000 a year, nonetheless, they see their own selves reflected in those arguments, and there's a reason why people follow it. It's a negotiation, isn't it, for a BBC style, because they've got a unique selling point. You can see that, and good luck to them, a lot of women stars on TV are going to be able to bid their prices up. But I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference just for most working women, because we're just not in that pay bracket.
But a lot of feminists, they kind of focus a lot on the gender pay gap. That's one of their obsessions. But given that the actual gender pay gap in the West has been shrinking, and there's even stats that show that women under 30 actually earn more than men, should it receive so much attention?
If you assess it over time, the reduction in the gender pay gap is quite remarkable. And I tracked it over a long time because I was looking at records of the way that people had argued the case and their optimism in the early years of the Equal Pay Act, which was quite high, because it closed it quite a lot initially. And then there was a lot of pessimism because that seemed to slow down. And people often talk about this as if it was a kind of intransigent, impossible problem that will never be resolved. But I'd say that it's fairly clear that this thing is disintegrating at a rate of knots, because you can feel already that the moral justifications for pay inequality are all pretty much gone. The great swathe of opinion is that inequality in pay and discrimination is not justifiable.
What kind of timescale, if ever, do you feel like it won't be sort of special for women or migrants to get involved? When will it just be the norm?
Honestly, I think we're there. There are a lot of professions where it's exceptional to have men work in there. Mm-hmm. In teaching, you've seen women have swept the board in teaching, and many schools struggle to get male teachers. In construction, they find it very hard to recruit women. I think it's because people don't like working in construction by and large. It's a pretty tough job and is migrant biased anyway. For years it was many Irish people working in construction, and more latterly lots of Poles working there. But that's because it's hard and onerous work. People just don't want to do it. I think we're here. I think we've reached that point. I mean, in some ways I think it's a generational thing. I think when you look at some workplaces, all the old guys, they're white guys, but all the younger workforce, it's a much more mixed workforce.
So do you feel like there's equality of opportunity throughout everyone?
I hate that phrase in a way, equality of opportunity. People that coined it were actually trying to frustrate the whole idea of equality. And it really kind of means equality to stab each other in the back and rat each other out, which is the labour market, isn't it? You know, it's full of petty jealousies and mean-spirited exchanges because we're all competing against each other. And in fact, we're all competing against each other a great deal more than we used to in the past. And in some ways that's good because it means people that never got a chance before do get a chance. But it's also, the people that are laughing are those who are at the top of this pile selecting, because they can happily select from amongst all the over-eager aspirant people. You know, it's a bit like in the 19th century, you know, in the docks, the hungry dockers used to queue up at the gate and they would say, oh, you and you and you. It was a very brutal kind of a thing. No, I understand why Hunger Games was a really popular film. I think for young people, especially coming into the labour market, it looks terrifying when you see what you're up against and you see these kind of over-ambitious girls from Camden School for Girls and with their millions of ballet certificates and all of this, and you think, oh my, you know, how will I ever manage? But that is, the modern labour market feels kind of brutal, though I think given the scale of the growth in employment, it feels maybe harsher than it is.
One of the things that struck me reading your history of it was how the ideas for sort of equal opportunities policies were very much something that came from the sort of fringes of the loony left, but now have been embraced by every corporation under the sun, it feels. If you think about the recent Google memo scandal, their diversity and equality policy is almost treated like a religion. The man who criticised it, although he had some quite retrograde ideas, I thought, he was sacked for basically challenging their policy.
Yeah, James Damore, I mean, it was a bit of a Twitter storm in the end, and he might have been better off if the memo had never been publicised. But I think what you're saying is right. To go back to the point where you start, that, you know, I count myself as part of this. When I went to work at Haringey Council, lots of people thought that the local authority could be a vehicle for fixing inequality, you know, and it would have ambitious policies of employment. And it was a loony left kind of a policy. Just a handful of people that kind of thought it up. There were people who were interested in addressing the questions of inequality, but they were somewhat modest in that they thought they would do it mainstream, you know, by employment through the local authority. They did some kind of relatively tokenistic work, but what they did do was they developed and pioneered a policy which later was adopted by banks. In the first instance, a lot of banks adopted the policy, and then slowly Ford UK was a big champion of the policy. And you kind of think, well, how did it come to be that all these mainstream, besuited, rather boring people came to be the protagonists of this big change? And I think the way it worked was this. The Equal Opportunities Policy is a kind of municipal socialist venture that Ken Livingstone had pioneered at the Greater London Council, really was crushed. And Mrs. Thatcher meant to do them over and eventually abolished the GLC. I think that she kind of had some inkling that if the Labour councils could build communities of support by allocating jobs, they would have a base that she didn't want them to have. And that's why she was determined to kind of do them over. So when the GLC was abolished, almost everybody, it seemed, that worked for it somehow got a job in the human resources department, either in a local authority or in a business. And instead of killing the idea, it was multiplied all over the place and everybody was taking it up. I think in part it was because when it was no longer a threat, you know, when they'd kind of depoliticized the whole claims in terms of race and gender, actually ordinary employers thought, well, this isn't so bad because we get to look good. We get to do all kinds of things that we would have liked to have done that we didn't dare do before. So one of the things they did was ethnic monitoring and lots of gender monitoring. Before then, it had been a real taboo to keep records of your employees, and trade unions would put a lot of pressure on them not to have company spies. But once it was in the service of this apparently progressive policy, it was okay for the employers to keep all kinds of information on the people that work for them. They could do things that they didn't do before, like performance review and individual contracts and a lot more bespoke management of individuals where you're kind of on top of them all the time. I don't mean to say, by the way, that the policies weren't meant. I think the managers that came in believed in them, but they also discovered that it gave them more authority over their employees. All of that process made a more malleable and a more divided workforce, because not necessarily divided on racial or sex lines, but even just individually fighting against each other, because you would be managed in that much more particular kind of a way.
I wasn't really sure whether you meant that the equal opportunities that were given to ethnic minorities and women sort of undermine the possibility of a genuine working class movement that would create an equality of wealth. Like, is there a direct correlation between those two things, or did they just happen at the same historical moment?
I think there's a relationship between the two, but the short answer is, if the trade union leaders had made equality across the board, including race equality and gender equality, at the fore, they would have owned that process, and they would have been in a much stronger position. You know, you could really see that we could have had anti-racist, anti-sexist policy from the left. That would have put everybody in a stronger position. You know, it would have made working class representation stronger. It would have made women's commitment to that organisation stronger, because they would feel that it was actually working for them instead of against them. And it would have made sure that ethnic minorities were not abused and manipulated in a way that implicated employees. A good radical campaign of race equality and sex equality really would have made a huge difference. And what we got was something different, a kind of top-down policy, which for individual women and for people of colour did have real advantages, because they got chances that they wouldn't have got in that other setup. But for working people, it didn't advance their position as a whole. They lost authority. Women workers and black workers too lost authority, because their position was more dependent upon the good graces of the employers. And that's, you know, you get that favour, it can be taken away and it could be used against you.
I was quite frustrated when I found out that the Equal Pay and Work Act, after that the employees would just give people like different work to pay them, and that kind of frustrated me.
It was shocking, and it was so shocking it shocked even the government. They would have men and women with the same job title with unequal pay before 1970. Then they brought in the act that said if you're doing the same job, you're going to have the same pay. And they said, oh, well, we'll just create other jobs, you know, just rebadge them. So it was outrageous, but it was even so outrageous that that's why the Sex Equality Act was brought in to shore it up. But employers dragged their feet. It took a long time to be won round. This is hard to say. I think often, you know, when you're looking at this, what you want to find is discrimination, and because it's like, ha, we got you. I can show that you're insincere, that you're a hypocrite, and that's exciting as a researcher. But over time, I thought, well, I've got to distrust that, because if you look to try and find discrimination, what you're missing is that there has been an actual transformation that's taking place, and that's quite hard for people to see. And I think anybody who's campaigning, they don't want to hear that actually women's pay has improved relative to men's, because they feel that undercuts their ability to make the argument. And I think we need to be thinking about different kinds of arguments and different ways of making the case for the pay we want and the rewards that people deserve than the ones that we've been making so far.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I would like to thank James and all our volunteers for a great discussion. And if you would like to take part in a Books and Buns, or if you would like to suggest a book for discussion, email us.